The Sword and the Idol. It was a cold winter's evening, late in the Stone Age. The sun had gone down blazing over the plains of Fold. There were no clouds, only the chill blue sky and the imminence of stars. And the surface of the sleeping earth began to harden against the cold of the night. Presently from their lairs arose and shook themselves and went stealthily forth those of earth's children to whom it is the law to prowl abroad as soon as the dusk has fallen. And they went pattering softly over the plain, and their eyes shone in the dark, and crossed and recrossed one another in their courses. Suddenly there became manifest in the midst of the plain that fearful portent of the presence of man, a little flickering fire. And the children of earth who prowl abroad by night looked sideways at it, and snarled, and edged away, all but the wolves, who came a little nearer, for it was winter and the wolves were hungry, and they had come in thousands from the mountains, and they said in their hearts, "We are strong." Around the fire a little tribe was encamped. They too had come from the mountains, and from lands beyond them, but it was in the mountains that the wolves first winded them. They picked up bones at first that the tribe had dropped, but they were closer now, and on all sides. It was Laws who had lit the fire. He had killed a small furry beast, hurling his stone axe at it, and had gathered a quantity of reddish-brown stones, and had laid them in a long row, and placed bits of the small beast all along it. Then he lit a fire on each side, and the stones heated, and the bits began to cook. It was at this time that the tribe noticed that the wolves who had followed them so far were no longer content with the scraps of deserted encampments. A line of yellow eyes surrounded them, and when it moved it was to come nearer. So the men of the tribe hastily tore up brushwood and felled a small tree with their flint axes, and heaped it all over the fire that Laws had made, and for a while the great heap hid the flame, and the wolves came trotting in and sat down again on their haunches, much closer than before. And the fierce and valiant dogs that belonged to the tribe believed that their end was about to come while fighting, as they had long since prophesied it would. Then the flame caught the lofty stack of brushwood, and rushed out of it, and ran up the side of it, and stood up haughtily far over the top. And the wolves, seeing this terrible ally of man reveling there in his strength, and knowing nothing of his frequent treachery to his masters, went slowly away as though they had other purposes. And for the rest of that night the dogs of the encampment cried out to them and besought them to come back. But the tribe lay down all around the fire under thick firs and slept. And a great wind arose and blew into the roaring heart of the fire till it was red no longer, but all pallid with heat. With the dawn the tribe awoke. Laws might have known that after such a mighty conflagration nothing could remain of his small furry beast, but there was hunger in him and little reason as he searched among the ashes. What he found there amazed him beyond measure. There was no meat, there was not even his row of reddish-brown stones, but something longer than a man's leg and narrower than his hand was lying there like a great flattened snake. When Laws looked at its thin edges and saw that it ran to a point, he picked up stones to chip it and make it sharp. It was the instinct of Laws to sharpen things. When he found that it could not be chipped, his wonderment increased. It was many hours before he discovered that he could sharpen the edges by rubbing them with a stone. But at last the point was sharp, and all one side of it except near the end, where Laws held it in his hand. And Laws lifted it and brandished it, and the Stone Age was over. That afternoon in the little encampment, just as the tribe moved on, the Stone Age passed away, which for perhaps 30 or 40,000 years had slowly lifted man from among the beasts and left him with his supremacy beyond all hope of reconquest. It was not for many days that any other man tried to make for himself an iron sword by cooking the same kind of small furry beast that Laws had tried to cook. It was not for many years that any thought to lay the meat along stones as Laws had done, and when they did, being no longer on the plains of Fold, they used flints or chalk. It was not for many generations that another piece of iron ore was melted, and the secret slowly guessed. Nevertheless, one of Earth's many veils was torn aside by laws to give us ultimately the steel sword and the plow, machinery, and factories. Let us not blame laws if we think that he did wrong, for he did all in ignorance. The tribe moved on until it came to water, and there it settled down under a hill, and they built their huts there. Very soon they had to fight with another tribe, a tribe that was stronger than they. But the sword of laws was terrible, and his tribe slew their foes. You might make one blow at laws, but then would come one thrust from that iron sword, and there was no way of surviving it. No one could fight with laws, and he became ruler of the tribe in the place of Iz, who hitherto had ruled it with his sharp axe, as his father had before him. Now Laws begat Lo, and in his old age gave his sword to him, and Lo ruled the tribe with it. And Lo called the name of the sword Death, because it was so swift and terrible. And Iz begat Erd, who was of no account. And Erd hated Lo, because he was of no account, by reason of the iron sword of Lo. One night Erd stole down to the hut of Lo, carrying his sharp axe, and he went very softly. But Lo's dog, Warner, heard him coming, and he growled softly by his master's door. When Erd came to the hut, he heard Lo talking gently to his sword, and Lo was saying, "Lie still, Death. Rest, rest, old sword." And then, "What, again, Death? Be still, be still." And then again, "What, art thou hungry, Death, or thirsty, poor old sword? Soon, Death, soon. Be still only a little." But Erd fled, for he did not like the gentle tone of Lo as he spoke to his sword. And Lo begat Lod, and when Lo died, Lod took the iron sword and ruled the tribe. And Erd begat Ith, who was of no account like his father. Now when Lod had smitten a man or killed a terrible beast, Ith would go away for a while into the forest, rather than hear the praises that would be given to Lod. And once, as Ith sat in the forest waiting for the day to pass, he suddenly thought he saw a tree trunk looking at him as with a face, and Ith was afraid, for trees should not look at men. But soon Ith saw that it was only a tree, and not a man, though it was like a man. Ith used to speak to this tree and tell it about Lod, for he dared not speak to anyone else about him, and Ith found comfort in speaking about Lod. One day Ith went with his stone axe into the forest and stayed there many days. He came back by night, and the next morning when the tribe awoke, they saw something that was like a man and yet was not a man, and it sat on the hill with its elbows pointing outwards and was quite still. And Ith was crouching before it, and hurriedly placing before it fruits and flesh, and then leaping away from it and looking frightened. Presently all the tribe came out to see, but dared not come quite close because of the fear that they saw in the face of Ith. And Ith went to his hut and came back again with a hunting spearhead and valuable small stone knives, and reached out and laid them before the thing that was like a man, and then sprang away from it. And some of the tribe questioned Ith about the still thing that was like a man, and Ith said, "This is Ged." Then they asked, "Who is Ged?" And Ith said, "Ged sends the crops and the rain, and the sun and the moon are Ged's." Then the tribe went back to their huts, but later in the day some came again, and they said to Ith, "Ged is only as we are, having hands and feet." And Ith pointed to the right hand of Ged, which was not as his left, but was shaped like the paw of a beast. And Ith said, "By this ye may know that he is not as any man." Then they said, "He is indeed Ged." But Lod said, "He speaketh not, nor doth he eat." And Ith answered, "The thunder is his voice, and the famine is his eating." After this the tribe copied Ith, and brought little gifts of meat to Ged, and ith cooked them before him that Ged might smell the cooking. One day a great thunderstorm came trampling up from the distance and raged among the hills, and the tribe all hid away from it in their huts. And ith appeared among the huts, looking unafraid, and ith said little, but the tribe thought that he had expected the terrible storm, because the meat that they had laid before Ged had been tough meat, and not the best parts of the beasts they slew. And Ged grew to have more honor among the tribe than Laud, and Laud was vexed. One night Laud arose when all were asleep, and quieted his dog, and took his iron sword, and went away to the hill. And he came on Ged in the starlight, sitting still, with his elbows pointing outwards, and his beast's paw, and the mark of the fire on the ground where his food had been cooked. And Laud stood there for a while in great fear, trying to keep to his purpose. Suddenly he stepped up close to Ged and lifted his iron sword, and Ged neither hit nor shrank. Then the thought came into Laud's mind, Ged does not hit. What will Ged do instead? And Laud lowered his sword and struck not, and his imagination began to work on that, what will Ged do instead? And the more Laud thought, the worse was his fear of Ged, and Laud ran away and left him. Laud still ruled the tribe in battle or in the hunt, but the chiefest spoils of battle were given to Ged, and the beasts that they slew were Ged's, and all questions that concerned war or peace, and questions of law and disputes, were always brought to him, and ith gave the answers after speaking to Ged by night. At last ith said, the day after an eclipse, that the gifts which they brought to Ged were not enough, that some far greater sacrifice was needed, that Ged was very angry even now, and not to be appeased by any ordinary sacrifice. And ith said that to save the tribe from the anger of Ged, he would speak to Ged that night and ask him what new sacrifice he needed. Deep in his heart Laud shuddered, for his instinct told him that Ged wanted Laud's only son, who should hold the iron sword when Laud was gone. No one would dare touch Laud because of the iron sword, but his instinct said in his slow mind again and again, Ged loves ith. Ith has said so. Ith hates the sword holders. Ith hates the sword holders. Ged loves ith. Evening fell, and the night came when ith should speak with Ged, and Laud became ever surer of the doom of his race. He lay down, but could not sleep. Midnight had barely come when Laud arose and went with his iron sword again to the hill. And there sat Ged. Had ith been to him yet? Ith, whom Ged loved, who hated the sword holders. And Laud looked long at the old sword of iron that had come to his grandfather on the plains of Fold. Goodbye, old sword. And Laud laid it on the knees of Ged, then went away. And when ith came, a little before dawn, the sacrifice was found acceptable unto Ged. End of The Sword and the Idol. The Idle City. There was once a city which was an idle city, wherein men told vain tales. And it was that city's custom to tax all men that would enter in with a toll of some idle story in the gate. So all men paid to the watchers in the gate the toll of an idle story, and passed into the city unhindered and unhurt. And in a certain hour of the night, when the king of that city arose and went pacing swiftly up and down the chamber of his sleeping, and called upon the name of the dead queen, then would the watchers fasten up the gate, and go into that chamber to the king, and, sitting on the floor, would tell him all the tales that they had gathered. And listening to them, some calmer mood would come upon the king, and listening still he would lie down again, and at last fall asleep. And all the watchers silently would arise and steal away from the chamber. A while ago wandering, I came to the gate of that city, and even as I came, a man stood up to pay his toll to the watchers. They were seated cross-legged on the ground between him and the gate, and each one held a spear. Near him 2 other travelers sat on the warm sand waiting, and the man said, "Now the city of Nambros forsook the worship of the gods and turned towards God. So the gods threw their cloaks over their faces and strode away from the city, and going into the haze among the hills passed through the trunks of the olive groves into the sunset. But when they had already left the earth, they turned and looked through the gleaming folds of the twilight for the last time at their city, and they looked half in anger and half in regret, then turned and went away forever. But they sent back a death who bore a scythe, saying to it, 'Slay half in the city that forsook us, but half of them spare alive, that they may yet remember their old forsaken gods.' But God sent a destroying angel to show that he was God, saying unto him, 'Go into that city and slay half of the dwellers therein, yet spare a half of them, that they may know that I am God.' And at once the destroying angel put his hand to his sword, and the sword came out of the scabbard with a deep breath, like to the breath that a broad woodman takes before his first blow at some giant oak. Thereat the angel pointed his arm downwards, and bending his head between them, fell forward from heaven's edge, and the spring of his ankles shot him downwards with his wings furled behind him. So he went slanting earthward through the evening with his sword stretched out before him, and he was like a javelin that some hunter hath hurled that returneth again to the earth. But just before he touched it, he lifted his head and spread his wings with the under feathers forward, and alighted by the bank of the broad Flavro that divides the city of Nambros. And down the bank of the Flavro he fluttered low like to a hawk over a new-cut cornfield when the little creatures of the corn are shelterless, and at the same time down the other bank the death from the gods went mowing. At once they saw each other, and the angel glared at the death, and the death leered back at him, and the flames in the eyes of the angel illumined with a red glare the mist that lay in the hollows of the sockets of the death. Suddenly they fell on one another, sword to scythe, and the angel captured the temples of the gods, and set up over them the sign of God, and the death captured the temples of God, and led into them the ceremonies and sacrifices of the gods. And all the while the centuries slipped quietly by, going down the Flavro seawards. And now some worship God in the temple of the gods, and others worship the gods in the temple of God. And still the angel hath not returned again to the rejoicing choirs, and still the death hath not gone back to die with the dead gods. But all through Nambros they fight up and down, and still on each side of the Flavro the city lives. And the watchers in the gate said, "Enter in." Then another traveler rose up and said, "Solemnly between Huanwazi and Nikrana the huge great clouds came floating, and those great mountains, heavenly Huanwazi and Nikrana, the king of peaks, greeted them, calling them brothers. And the clouds were glad of their greeting, for they meet with companions seldom in the lonely heights of the sky. But the vapors of evening said unto the earth mist, What are those shapes that dare to move above us and go to where Nikrana is and Huanwazi? And the earth mist said in answer to the vapors of evening, It is only an earth mist that has become mad, and has left the warm and comfortable earth, and has in his madness thought that his place is with Huanwazi and Nikrana. Once, said the vapors of evening, there were clouds, but this was many and many a day ago, as our forefathers have said. Perhaps the mad one thinks he is the clouds. Then spake the earthworms from the warm deeps of the mud, saying, O earth mist, thou art indeed the clouds, and there are no clouds but thou. And as for Huanwazi and Nikrana, I cannot see them, and therefore they are not high, and there are no mountains in the world but those that I cast up every morning out of the deeps of the mud. And the earth mist and the vapors of evening were glad at the voice of the earthworms, and looking earthward believed what they had said. And indeed it is better to be as the earth mist, and to keep close to the warm mud at night, and to hear the earthworm's comfortable speech, and not to be a wanderer in the cheerless heights, but to leave the mountains alone with their desolate snow, to draw what comfort they can from their vast aspect over all the cities of men, and from the whispers that they hear at evening of unknown distant gods. And the watchers in the gate said, "Enter in." Then a man stood up who came out of the west, and told a western tale. He said, "There is a road in Rome that runs through an ancient temple that once the gods had loved. It runs along the top of a great wall, and the floor of the temple lies far down beneath it, of marble, pink and white. Upon the temple floor I counted to the number of 13 hungry cats. Sometimes, they said among themselves, it was the gods that lived here, sometimes it was men, and now it's cats. So let us enjoy the sun on the hot marble before another people comes." For it was at that hour of a warm afternoon when my fancy is able to hear silent voices. And the awful leanness of all those 13 cats moved me to go into a neighboring fish shop, and there to buy a quantity of fishes. Then I returned and threw them all over the railing at the top of the great wall, and they fell for 30 feet and hit the sacred marble with a smack. Now in any other town but Rome, or in the minds of any other cats, the sight of fishes falling out of heaven had surely excited wonder. They rose slowly and all stretched themselves. Then they came leisurely toward the fishes. "It is only a miracle," they said in their hearts. And the watchers in the gate said, "Enter in." Proudly and slowly, as they spoke, drew up to them a camel, whose rider sought entrance to the city. His face shone with the sunset by which for long he had steered for the city's gate. Of him they demanded toll. Whereat he spoke to his camel, and the camel roared and kneeled, and the man descended from him. And the man unwrapped from many silks a box of divers metals wrought by the Japanese, and on the lid of it were figures of men who gazed from some shore at an isle of the inland sea. This he showed to the watchers, and when they had seen it, said, "It has seemed to me that these speak to each other thus: Behold now Oojni, the dear one of the sea, the little mother sea that hath no storms. She goeth out from Oojni singing a song, and she returneth singing over her sands. Little is Oojni in the lap of the sea, and scarce to be perceived by wandering ships. White sails have never wafted her legends afar, they are told not by bearded wanderers of the sea. Her fireside tales are known not to the north, the dragons of China have not heard of them, nor those that ride on elephants through Ind. Men tell the tales, and the smoke ariseth upwards, the smoke departeth, and the tales are told. Oojni is not a name among the nations. She is not known of where the merchants meet. She is not spoken of by alien lips. Indeed, but Oojni is little among the isles, yet is she loved by those that know her coasts and her inland places hidden from the sea. Without glory, without fame, and without wealth, Oojni is greatly loved by a little people, and by a few. Yet not by a few, for all her dead still love her, and oft by night come whispering through her woods. Who could forget Oojni, even among the dead? For here in Oojni, wot you, are homes of men, and gardens, and golden temples of the gods, and sacred places inshore from the sea, and many murmurous woods. And there is a path that winds over the hills to go into mysterious holy lands, where dance by night the spirits of the woods, or sing unseen in the sunlight. And no one goes into these holy lands, for who that love Oojni could rob her of her mysteries? And the curious aliens come not. Indeed, but we love Oojni, though she is so little. She is the little mother of our race, and the kindly nurse of all seafaring birds. And behold, even now caressing her, the gentle fingers of the mother sea, whose dreams are far with that old wanderer, Ocean. And yet let us not forget Fusiyama, for he stands manifest over clouds and sea, misty below, and vague and indistinct, but clear above for all the isles to watch. The ships make all their journeys in his sight. The nights and the days go by him like a wind. The summers and winters under him flicker and fade. The lives of men pass quietly here and hence, and Fusiyama watches there and knows. And the watchers in the gate said, "Enter in." And I too would have told them a tale very wonderful and very true, one that I had told in many cities which as yet had no believers. But now the sun had set, and the brief twilight gone, and ghostly silences were rising from far and darkening hills. A stillness hung over that city's gate, and the great silence of the solemn night was more acceptable to the watchers in the gate than any sound of man. Therefore they beckoned to us, and motioned with their hands that we should pass untaxed into the city. And softly we went up over the sand and between the high rock pillars of the gate, and a deep stillness settled among the watchers, and the stars over them twinkled undisturbed. For how short a while man speaks, and withal how vainly, and for how long he is silent. Only the other day I met a king in Thebes who had been silent already for 4,000 years. End of the Idle City. The Hashish Man. I was at a dinner in London the other day. The ladies had gone upstairs, and no one sat on my right. On my left there was a man I did not know, but he knew my name somehow apparently, for he turned to me after a while and said, "I read a story of yours about Bethmora in a review." Of course I remembered the tale. It was about a beautiful oriental city that was suddenly deserted in a day. Nobody quite knew why. I said, "Oh yes," and slowly searched in my mind for some more fitting acknowledgment of the compliment that his memory had paid me. I was greatly astonished when he said, "You were wrong about the Nausar sickness. It was not that at all." I said, "Why, have you been there?" And he said, "Yes, I do it with hashish. I know Bethmora well." And he took out of his pocket a small box full of some black stuff that looked like tar but had a stranger smell. He warned me not to touch it with my finger, as the stain remained for days. "I got it from a gypsy," he said. He had a lot of it, as it had killed his father. But I interrupted him, for I wanted to know for certain what it was that had made desolate that beautiful city, Bethmora, and why they fled from it swiftly in a day. Was it because of the desert's curse, I asked? And he said, "Partly it was the fury of the desert, and partly the advice of the emperor, Thubamlin, for that fearful beast is in some way connected with the desert on his mother's side." And he told me this strange story. You remember the sailor with the black scar who was there on the day that you described when the messengers came on mules to the gate of Bethmora and all the people fled? I met this man in a tavern drinking rum, and he told me all about the flight from Bethmora, but knew no more than you did what the message was or who had sent it. However, he said he would see Bethmora once more whenever he touched again at an eastern port, even if he had to face the devil. He often said that he would face the devil to find out the mystery of that message that had emptied Bethmora in a day. And in the end he had to face Thubamlin, whose weak ferocity he had not imagined. For one day the sailor told me he had found a ship, and I met him no more after that in the tavern drinking rum. It was about that time that I got the hashish from the gypsy, who had a quantity that he did not want. It takes one literally out of oneself. It is like wings. You swoop over distant countries and into other worlds. Once I found out the secret of the universe. I have forgotten what it was, But I know that the Creator does not take creation seriously, for I remember that he sat in space with all his work in front of him and laughed. I have seen incredible things in fearful worlds. As it is your imagination that takes you there, so it is only by your imagination that you can get back. Once, out in the ether, I met a battered, prowling spirit that had belonged to a man whom drugs had killed 100 years ago, and he led me to regions that I had never imagined, and we parted in anger beyond the Pleiades, and I could not imagine my way back. And I met a huge gray shape that was the spirit of some great people, perhaps of a whole star, and I besought it to show me my way home, and it halted beside me like a sudden wind and pointed, and, speaking quite softly, asked me if I discerned a certain tiny light, and I saw a far star faintly, and then it said to me, "That is the solar system," and strode tremendously on. And somehow I imagined my way back, and only just in time, for my body was already stiffening in a chair in my room, and the fire had gone out and everything was cold, and I had to move each finger one by one, and there were pins and needles in them, and dreadful pains in the nails, which began to thaw. And at last I could move one arm, and reached a bell, and for a long time no one came, because everyone was in bed. But at last a man appeared, and they got a doctor, and he said that it was hashish poisoning, but it would have been all right if I hadn't met that battered, prowling spirit. I could tell you astounding things that I have seen, but you want to know who sent that message to Bethmora. Well, it was Thumbumlean, and this is how I know. I often went to the city after that day you wrote of. I used to take hashish of an evening in my flat, and I always found it uninhabited. Sand had poured into it from the desert, and the streets were yellow and smooth, and through open swinging doors the sand had drifted. One evening I had put the guard in front of the fire, and settled into a chair and eaten my hashish. And the first thing that I saw when I came to Bethmora was a sailor with the black scar, strolling down the street and making footprints in the yellow sand. And now I knew that I should see what secret power it was that kept Bethmora uninhabited. I saw that there was anger in the desert, for there were storm clouds heaving along the skyline, and I heard a muttering amongst the sand. The sailor strolled down the street, looking into the empty houses as he went. Sometimes he shouted, and sometimes he sang, and sometimes he wrote his name on a marble wall. Then he sat down on a step and ate his dinner. After a while he grew tired of the city and came back up the street. As he reached the gate of green copper, 3 men on camels appeared. I could do nothing. I was only a consciousness, invisible, wandering. My body was in Europe. The sailor fought well with his fists, but he was overpowered and bound with ropes and led away through the desert. I followed for as long as I could stay, and found that they were going by way of the desert round the hills of Hap towards Utnarvahi, and then I knew the camel men belonged to Thumbumlean. I work in an insurance office all day, and I hope you won't forget me if you ever want to insure life, fire, or motor, but that's no part of my story. I was desperately anxious to get back to my flat, though it is not good to take hashish 2 days running. But I wanted to see what they would do to the poor fellow, for I had heard bad rumors about Thumbumlean. When at last I got away, I had a letter to write. Then I rang for my servant and told him I must not be disturbed, though I left my door unlocked in case of accidents. After that I made up a good fire, and sat down and partook of the pot of dreams. I was going to the palace of Thumbumlean. I was kept back longer than usual by noises in the street, but suddenly I was up above the town. The European countries rushed by beneath me, and there appeared the thin white palace spires of horrible Thumbumlean. I found him presently at the end of a little narrow room. A curtain of red leather hung behind him, on which all the names of God, written in Yonish, were worked with a golden thread. 3 windows were small and high. The emperor seemed no more than about 20, and looked small and weak. No smiles came on his nasty yellow face, though he tittered continually. As I looked from his low forehead to his quivering under lip, I became aware that there was some horror about him, though I was not able to perceive what it was. And then I saw it. The man never blinked, and though later on I watched those eyes for a blink, it never happened once. And then I followed the Emperor's rapt glance, and I saw the sailor lying on the floor, alive but hideously rent, and the royal torturers were at work all round him. They had torn long strips from him, but had not detached them, and they were torturing the ends of them far away from the sailor. The man that I met at dinner told me many things which I must omit. The sailor was groaning softly, and every time he groaned, Thubamline tittered. I had no sense of smell, but I could hear and see, and I do not know which was the most revolting, the terrible condition of the sailor or the happy, unblinking face of horrible Thubamline. I wanted to go away, but the time was not yet come, and I had to stay where I was. Suddenly the Emperor's face began to twitch violently, and his under lip quivered faster, and he whimpered with anger, and cried with a shrill voice in Yiddish to the captain of his torturers that there was a spirit in the room. I feared not, for living men cannot lay hands on a spirit, but all the torturers were appalled at his anger, and stopped their work, for their hands trembled in fear. Then 2 men of the spear guard slipped from the room, and each of them brought back presently a golden bowl with knobs on it, full of hashish, and the bowls were large enough for heads to have floated in had they been filled with blood. And the 2 men fell to rapidly, each eating with 2 great spoons. There was enough in each spoonful to have given dreams to 100 men. And there came upon them soon the hashish state, and their spirits hovered, preparing to go free, while I feared horribly, but ever and anon they fell back again to their bodies, recalled by some noise in the room. Still the men ate, but lazily now, and without ferocity. At last the great spoons dropped out of their hands, and their spirits rose and left them. I could not flee, and the spirits were more horrible than the men, because they were young men and not yet wholly molded to fit their fearful souls. Still the sailor groaned softly, evoking little titters from the Emperor Thubamline. Then the 2 spirits rushed at me and swept me thence as gusts of wind sweep butterflies, and away we went from that small, pale, heinous man. There was no escaping from these spirits' fierce insistence. The energy in my minute lump of the drug was overwhelmed by the huge spoonsful that these men had eaten with both hands. I was whirled over Arvel Woundery and brought to the lands of Snith, and swept on still until I came to Cragua, and beyond this to those bleak lands that are nearly unknown to fancy. And we came at last to those ivory hills that are named the Mountains of Madness, and I tried to struggle against the spirits of that frightful Emperor's men, for I heard on the other side of the ivory hills the pittering of those beasts that prey on the mad, as they prowled up and down. It was no fault of mine that my little lump of hashish could not fight with their horrible spoonsful. Someone was tugging at the hall door bell. Presently a servant came and told our host that a policeman in the hall wished to speak to him at once. He apologized to us and went outside, and we heard a man in heavy boots who spoke in a low voice to him. My friend got up and walked over to the window and opened it and looked outside. "I should think it will be a fine night," he said. Then he jumped out. When we put our astonished heads out of the window to look for him, he was already out of sight. End of The Hashish Man. Poor Old Bill. On an antique haunt of sailors, a tavern of the sea, the light of day was fading. For several evenings I had frequented this place, in the hope of hearing something from the sailors, as they sat over strange wines, about a rumor that had reached my ears of a certain fleet of galleons of old Spain,
still said to be afloat in the South Seas in some uncharted region. In this again I was to be disappointed. Talk was low and seldom, and I was about to leave when a sailor, wearing earrings of pure gold, lifted up his head from his wine, and looking straight before him at the wall, told his tale loudly. When later on a storm of rain arose and thundered on the tavern's leaded panes, he raised his voice without effort and spoke on still. The darker it got, the clearer his wild eyes shone.
A ship with sails of the olden time was nearing fantastic isles. We had never seen such isles.
We all hated the captain, and he hated us. He hated us all alike. There was no favoritism about him. And he never would talk a word with any of us, except sometimes in the evening when it was getting dark. He would stop and look up and talk a bit to the men he had hanged at the yardarm. We were a mutinous crew, but Captain was the only man that had pistols. He slept with one under his pillow and kept one close beside him. There was a nasty look about the isles. They were small and flat as though they had come up only recently from the sea, and they had no sand or rocks like honest isles, but green grass down to the water, and there were little cottages there whose looks we did not like. Their thatches came almost down to the ground, and were strangely turned up at the corners, and under the low eaves were queer dark windows whose little leaded panes were too thick to see through, and no one, man or beast, was walking about, so that you could not know what kind of people lived there. But Captain knew, and he went ashore and into one of the cottages, and someone lit lights inside, and the little windows wore an evil look. It was quite dark when he came aboard again, and he bade a cheery good night to the men that swung from the yardarm, and he eyed us in a way that frightened poor old Bill. Next night we found that he had learned to curse, for he came on a lot of us asleep in our bunks, and among them poor old Bill, and he pointed at us with a finger and made a curse that our souls should stay all night at the top of the masts. And suddenly there was the soul of poor old Bill, sitting like a monkey at the top of the mast and looking at the stars and freezing through and through. We got up a little mutiny after that, but Captain comes up and points with his finger again, and this time poor old Bill and all the rest are swimming behind the ship through the cold green water, though their bodies remain on deck. It was the cabin boy who found out that Captain couldn't curse when he was drunk, though he could shoot as well at one time as another. After that it was only a matter of waiting, and of losing 2 men when the time came. Some of us were murderous fellows and wanted to kill Captain, but poor old Bill was for finding a bit of an island, out of the track of ships, and leaving him there with his share of our year's provisions. And everybody listened to poor old Bill, and we decided to maroon Captain as soon as we caught him when he couldn't curse. It was 3 whole days before Captain got drunk again, and poor old Bill and all had a dreadful time, for Captain invented new curses every day, and wherever he pointed his finger our souls had to go. And the fishes got to know us, and so did the stars, and none of them pitied us when we froze on the masts or were hurried through forests of seaweed and lost our way. Both stars and fishes went about their businesses with cold, unastonished eyes. Once, when the sun had set and it was twilight, and the moon was showing clearer and clearer in the sky, and we stopped our work for a moment because Captain seemed to be looking away from us at the colors in the sky, he suddenly turned and sent our souls to the moon. And it was colder there than ice at night, and there were horrible mountains making shadows, and it was all as silent as miles of tombs. And earth was shining up in the sky as big as the blade of a scythe, and we all got homesick for it, but could not speak nor cry. It was quite dark when we got back, and we were very respectful to Captain all the next day, but he cursed several of us again very soon. What we all feared most was that he would curse our souls to hell, and none of us mentioned hell above a whisper for fear that it should remind him. But on the third evening the cabin boy came and told us that Captain was drunk, and we all went to his cabin and we found him lying there across his bunk, and he shot as he had never shot before, but he had no more than the 2 pistols, and he would only have killed 2 men if he hadn't caught Joe over the head with the end of one of his pistols. And then we tied him up, and poor old Bill put the rum between the captain's teeth and kept him drunk for 2 days so that he could not curse, till we found a convenient rock. And before sunset of the second day we found a nice bare island for Captain, out of the track of ships, about 100 yards long and about 80 wide, and we rowed him along to it in a little boat and gave him provisions for a year, the same as we had ourselves, because poor old Bill wanted to be fair, and we left him sitting comfortable with his back to a rock singing a sailor's song. When we could no longer hear Captain singing, we all grew very cheerful and made a banquet out of our year's provisions, as we had all hoped to be home again in under 3 weeks. We had 3 great banquets every day for a week. Every man had more than he could eat, and what was left over we threw on the floor like gentlemen. And then one day, as we saw San Juanigatos and wanted to sail in and spend our money, the wind changed round from behind us and beat us out to sea. There was no tacking against it, and no getting into the harbor, though other ships sailed by us and anchored there. Sometimes a dead calm would fall on us, while fishing boats all around us flew before half a gale, and sometimes the wind would beat us out to sea when nothing else was moving. All day we tried, then at night we laid to and tried again the next day. And all the sailors of the other ships were spending their money in San Juanigatos, and we could not come nigh it. Then we spoke terrible things against the wind and against San Juanigatos, and sailed away. It was just the same at Narena. We kept close together now, and talked in low voices. Suddenly poor old Bill grew frightened. As we went all along the Saractic coastline, we tried again and again, and the wind was waiting for us in every harbor and sent us out to sea. Even the little islands would not have us. And then we knew that there was no landing yet for poor old Bill, and every one upbraided his kind heart that had made them maroon Captain on a rock, so as not to have his blood upon their heads. There was nothing to do but drift about the seas. There were no banquets now, because we feared that Captain might live his year and keep us out to sea. At first we used to hail all passing ships, and used to try to board them in the boats, but there was no towing against Captain's curse, and we had to give that up. So we played cards for a year in Captain's cabin, night and day, storm and fine, and everyone promised to pay poor old Bill when we got ashore. It was horrible to us to think what a frugal man Captain really was, he that used to get drunk every other day whenever he was at sea, and here he was still alive, and sober too, for his curse still kept us out of every port, and our provisions were gone. Well, it came to drawing lots, and Jim was the unlucky one. Jim only kept us about 3 days, and then we drew lots again, and this time it was the nigger. The nigger didn't keep us any longer, and we drew again, and this time it was Charlie, and still Captain was alive. As we got fewer, one of us kept us longer. Longer and longer a mate used to last us, and we all wondered however Captain did it. It was 5 weeks over the year when we drew Mike, and he kept us for a week, and Captain was still alive. We wondered if he didn't get tired of the same old curse, but we supposed things look different when one is alone on an island. When there was only Jakes and poor old Bill and the cabin boy and Dick, we didn't draw any longer. We said that the cabin boy had had all the luck, and he mustn't expect any more. Then poor old Bill was alone with Jakes and Dick, and Captain was still alive. When there was no more boy, and the Captain's still alive, Dick, who was a huge, strong man like poor old Bill, said that it was Jake's turn, and he was very lucky to have lived as long as he had. But poor old Bill talked it all over with Jake's, and they thought it better than Dick should take his turn. Then there was Jake's and poor old Bill, and Captain would not die. And these two used to watch one another night and day, when Dick was gone and no one else was left to them. And at last poor old Bill fell down in a faint and lay there for an hour. Then Jakes came up to him slowly with his knife and makes a stab at poor old Bill as he lies there on the deck. And poor old Bill caught hold of him by the wrist and put his knife into him twice to make sure, although it spoiled the best part of the meat. Then poor old Bill was all alone at sea. And the very next week, before the food gave out, Captain must have died on his bit of an island, for poor old Bill heard the Captain's soul going cursing over the sea, and the day after that the ship was cast on a rocky coast. And Captain's been dead now for over 100 years, and poor old Bill is safe ashore again. But it looks as if Captain hadn't done with him yet, for poor old Bill doesn't ever get any older, and somehow or other he doesn't seem to die.
Poor old Bill.
When this was over, the man's fascination suddenly snapped, and we all jumped up and left him. It was not only his revolting story, but it was the fearful look in the eyes of the man who told it, and the terrible ease with which his voice surpassed the roar of the rain, that decided me never again to enter that haunt of sailors, the Tavern of the Sea.
End of Poor Old Bill. The Beggars. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I was walking down Piccadilly not long ago, thinking of nursery rhymes and regretting old romance. As I saw the shopkeepers walk by in their black frock coats and their black hats, I thought of the old line in nursery annals. The merchants of London, they wear scarlet. The streets were all so unromantic, dreary. Nothing could be done for them, I thought. Nothing. And then my thoughts were interrupted by barking dogs. Every dog in the street seemed to be barking. Every kind of dog, not only the little ones, but the big ones too. They were all facing east towards the way I was coming by. Then I turned round to look, and had this vision in Piccadilly on the opposite side to the houses just after you pass the cab rank. Tall, bent men were coming down the street, arrayed in marvelous cloaks. All were sallow of skin and swarthy of hair, and most of them wore strange beards. They were coming slowly, and they walked with staves, and their hands were out for alms. All the beggars had come to town. I would have given them a gold doubloon engraven with the towers of Castile, but I had no such coin. They did not seem the people to whom it were fitting to offer the same coin as one tendered for the use of a taxicab. O marvelous ill-made word, surely the password somewhere of some evil order. Some of them wore purple cloaks with wide green borders, and the border of green was a narrow strip with some, and some wore cloaks of old and faded red, and some wore violet cloaks, and none wore black. And they begged gracefully as gods might beg for souls. I stood by a lamp-post, and they came up to it, and one addressed it, calling the lamp-post brother, and said, "O lamp-post, our brother of the dark, are there many wrecks by thee in the tides of night? Sleep not, brother, sleep not. There were many wrecks, and it were not for thee." It was strange. I had not thought of the majesty of the street lamp and his long watching over drifting men, but he was not beneath the notice of these cloaked strangers. And then one murmured to the street, "Art thou weary, street? Yet a little longer they shall go up and down, and keep thee clad with tar and wooden bricks. Be patient, street, In a while the earthquake cometh. Who are you? People said, and where do you come from? Who may tell what we are? They answered, or whence we come? And one turned toward the smoke-stained houses, saying, Blessed be the houses, because men dream therein. Then I perceived what I had never thought, that all these staring houses were not alike, but different from one another, because they held different dreams. And another turned to a tree that stood by the Green Park railings, saying, Take comfort, tree, for the fields shall come again. And all the while the ugly smoke went upwards, the smoke that has stifled romance and blackened the birds. This, I thought, they can neither praise nor bless. And when they saw it, they raised their hands towards it, towards the thousand chimneys, saying, Behold the smoke! The old coal forests that have lain so long in the dark and so long still are dancing now and going back to the sun. Forget not earth, O our brother, and we wish thee joy of the sun. It had rained, and a cheerless stream dropped down a dirty gutter. It had come from heaps of refuse, foul and forgotten. It had gathered upon its way things that were derelict, and went to somber drains unknown to man or the sun. It was this sullen stream, as much as all other causes, that had made me say in my heart that the town was vile, that beauty was dead in it, and romance fled. Even this thing they blessed, and one that wore a purple cloak with broad green border said, Brother, be hopeful yet, for thou shalt surely come at last to the delectable sea, and meet the heaving, huge, and travelled ships, and rejoice by isles that know the golden sun. Even thus they blessed the gutter, and I felt no whim to mock. And the people that went by in their black unseemly coats and their misshapen, monstrous, shiny hats, the beggars also blessed. And one of them said to one of these dark citizens, O twin of night himself, with thy specks of white at wrist and neck, like to night's scattered stars, how fearfully thou dost veil with black thy hid, unguessed desires. They are deep thoughts in thee, that they will not frolic with color, that they say no to purple and to lovely green, begone. Thou hast wild fancies that they must needs be tamed with black, and terrible imaginings that they must be hidden thus. Has thy soul dreams of the angels and of the walls of faery, that thou hast guarded it so utterly, lest it dazzle astonished eyes? Even so God hid the diamond deep down in miles of clay. The wonder of thee is not marred by mirth. Behold, thou art very secret. Be wonderful, be full of mystery. Silently the man in the black frock-coat passed on, and I came to understand when the purple beggar had spoken that the dark citizen had trafficked perhaps with Ind, that in his heart were strange and dumb ambitions, that his dumbness was founded by solemn right on the roots of ancient tradition, that it might be overcome one day by a cheer in the street, or by someone singing a song, and that when this shopman spoke, there might come clefts in the world, and people peering over at the abyss. Then, turning towards Green Park, where as yet spring was not, the beggars stretched out their hands, and looking at the frozen grass and the yet unbudding trees, they, chanting all together, prophesied daffodils. A motor omnibus came down the street, nearly running over some of the dogs that were barking ferociously still. It was sounding its horn noisily. And the vision went then. End of the Beggars. Carcassone. Preface. In a letter from a friend whom I have never seen, one of those that reads my books, this line was quoted. But he never came to Carcassone. I do not know the origin of the line, but I made this tale about it. When Camarac reigned at Arne, and the world was fairer, he gave a festival to all the Weald to commemorate the splendor of his youth. They say that his house at Arn was huge and high, and its ceiling painted blue, and when evening fell, men would climb up by ladders and light the scores of candles hanging from slender chains. And they say, too, that sometimes a cloud would come and pour in through the top of one of the oriel windows, and it would come over the edge of the stonework as the sea mist comes over a sheer cliff's shaven lip, where an old wind has blown forever and ever. He has swept away thousands of leaves and thousands of centuries. They are all one to him. He owes no allegiance to time. And the cloud would reshape itself in the hall's lofty vault and drift on through it slowly, and out to the sky again through another window. And from its shape the knights in Camarac's hall would prophesy the battles and sieges of the next season of war. They say of the hall of Camarac at Arn that there hath been none like it in any land, and foretell that there will be never. Hither had come in the folk of the Weald from sheepfold and from forest, revolving slow thoughts of food and shelter and love, and they sat down wondering in that famous hall. And therein also were seated the men of Arn, the town that clustered round the king's high house, and all was roofed with red maternal earth. If old songs may be trusted, it was a marvelous hall. Many who sat there could only have seen it distantly before, a clear shape in the landscape, but smaller than a hill. Now they beheld along the wall the weapons of Camarac's men, of which already the lute players made songs, and tales were told at evening in the byres. There they described the shield of Camarac that had gone to and fro across so many battles, and the sharp but dinted edges of his sword. There were the weapons of Gadriel the leal, and Norn, and Athoric of the sleety sword, Hariel the wild, Yerald, and Thanga of Esk. Their arms hung evenly all round the hall, low where a man could reach them, and in the place of honor in the midst, between the arms of Camarac and of Gadriel the leal, hung the harp of Arleon. And of all the weapons hanging on those walls, none were more calamitous to Camarac's foes than was the harp of Arleon. For to a man that goes up against a strong place on foot, pleasant indeed is the twang and jolt of some fearful engine of war that his fellow warriors are working behind him, from which huge rocks go sighing over his head and plunge among his foes. And pleasant to a warrior in the wavering light are the swift commands of his king, and a joy to him are his comrades' instant cheers, exulting suddenly at a turn of the war. All this and more was the harp to Camarac's men, for not only would it cheer his warriors on, but many a time would Arleon of the harp strike wild amazement into opposing hosts by some rapturous prophecy suddenly shouted out while his hand swept over the roaring strings. Moreover, no war was ever declared till Camarac and his men had listened long to the harp, and were elate with the music and mad against peace. Once Arleon, for the sake of a rhyme, had made war upon Esteban, and an evil king was overthrown, and honor and glory won. From such queer motives does good sometimes accrue. Above the shields and the harps all round the hall were the painted figures of heroes of fabulous famous songs, too trivial, because too easily surpassed by Camarac's men, seemed all the victories that the earth had known. Neither was any trophy displayed of Camarac's 70 battles, for these were as nothing to his warriors or him, compared with those things that their youth had dreamed, and which they mightily purposed yet to do. Above the painted pictures there was darkness, for evening was closing in, and the candles swinging on their slender chains were not yet lit in the roof. It was as though a piece of the night had been built into the edifice like a huge natural rock that juts into a house. And there sat all the warriors of Arn and the Weald folk wondering at them.
and none were more than 30, and all were skilled in war. And Camarac sat at the head of all, exulting in his youth. We must wrestle with time for some 7 decades, and he is a weak and puny antagonist in the first 3 bouts. Now there was present at this feast a diviner, one who knew the schemes of fate, and he sat among the people of the Weald, and had no place of honor, for Camarac and his men had no fear of fate. And when the meat was eaten and the bones cast aside, the king rose up from his chair, and having drunken wine, and being in the glory of his youth, and with all his knights about him, called to the diviner, saying, Prophesy. And the diviner rose up, stroking his grey beard, and spake guardedly. There are certain events, he said, upon the ways of fate that are veiled even from a diviner's eyes, and many more are clear to us that were better veiled from all. Much I know that is better unforetold, and some things that I may not foretell on pain of centuries of punishment. But this I know and foretell, that you will never come to Carcassone. Instantly there was a buzz of talk telling of Carcassone. Some had heard of it in speech or song, some had read of it, and some had dreamed of it. And the king sent Arleon of the harp down from his right hand to mingle with the Weald folk to hear aught that any told of Carcassone. But the warriors told of the places they had won to, many a hard-held fortress, many a far-off land, and swore that they would come to Carcassone. And in a while came Arleon back to the king's right hand, and raised his harp, and chanted, and told of Carcassone. Far away it was, and far away, a city of gleaming ramparts rising one over other, and marble terraces behind the ramparts, and fountains shimmering on the terraces. To Carcassone the elf kings with their fairies had first retreated from men, and had built it on an evening late in May by blowing their elfin horns. Carcassone, Carcassone. Travelers had seen it sometimes like a clear dream, with the sun glittering on its citadel upon a far-off hilltop, and then the clouds had come or a sudden mist. No one had seen it long or come quite close to it, though once there were some men that came very near, and the smoke from the houses blew into their faces. A sudden gust, no more, and these declared that someone was burning cedar wood there. Men had dreamed that there is a witch there, walking alone through the cold courts and corridors of Marmorian palaces, fearfully beautiful and still for all her 80 centuries, singing the second oldest song, which was taught her by the sea, shedding tears for loneliness from eyes that would madden armies. Yet will she not call her dragons home. Carcassone is terribly guarded. Sometimes she swims in a marble bath through whose deeps a river tumbles, or lies all morning on the edge of it to dry slowly in the sun, and watches the heaving river trouble the deeps of the bath. It flows through the caverns of earth for further than she knows, and coming to light in the witch's bath, goes down through the earth again to its own peculiar sea. In autumn sometimes it comes down black with snow that spring has molten in unimagined mountains, or withered blooms of mountain shrubs go beautifully by. When there is blood in the bath, she knows there is war in the mountains, and yet she knows not where those mountains are. When she sings, the fountains dance up from the dark earth. When she combs her hair, they say there are storms at sea. When she is angry, the wolves grow brave, and all come down to the byres. When she is sad, the sea is sad, and both are sad forever. Carcassone, Carcassone. This city is the fairest of the wonders of morning. The sun shouts when he beholdeth it. For Carcassone,
evening weepeth when evening passeth away. And Arleon told how many goodly perils were round about the city, and how the way was unknown, and it was a nightly venture. Then all the warriors stood up and sang of the splendor of the venture, and Camarac swore by the gods that had built Arn, and by the honor of his warriors, that, alive or dead, he would come to Carcassone. But the diviner rose and passed out of the hall, brushing the crumbs from him with his hands and smoothing his robe as he went. Then Camarac said, "There are many things to be planned, and counsels to be taken, and provender to be gathered. Upon what day shall we start?" And all the warriors answering shouted, "Now!" And Camarac smiled thereat, for he had but tried them. Down then from the walls they took their weapons, Sycorax, Caleron, Asloff, Wool of the Axe, Huanoth, Peacebreaker, Wolwoff, Father of War, Terion, Lurth of the War Cry, and many another. Little then dreamed the spiders that sat in that ringing hall of the unmolested leisure they were soon to enjoy. When they were armed, they all formed up and marched out of the hall, and Arleon strode before them, singing of Carcassone. But the folk of the Weald arose and went back well fed to the byres. They had no need of wars or of rare perils. They were ever at war with hunger. A long drought or hard winter were to them pitched battles. If the wolves entered a sheepfold, it was like the loss of a fortress. A thunderstorm on the harvest was like an ambuscade. Well fed, they went back slowly to their byres, being at truce with hunger, and the night filled with stars. And black against the starry sky appeared the round helms of the warriors as they passed the tops of the ridges, but in the valleys they sparkled now and then as the starlight flashed on steel. They followed behind Arleon going south, whence rumors had always come of Carcassone. So they marched in the starlight, and he before them singing. When they had marched so far that they had heard no sound from Arn, and even inaudible were her swinging bells, when candles burning late far up in towers no longer sent them their disconsolate welcome, in the midst of the pleasant night that lulls the rural spaces, weariness came upon Arleon, and his inspiration failed. It failed slowly. Gradually he grew less sure of the way to Carcassone. A while he stopped to think, and remembered the way again. But his clear certainty was gone, and in its place were efforts in his mind to recall old prophecies and shepherd songs that were told of the marvelous city. Then, as he said over carefully to himself a song that a wanderer had learnt from a goatherd's boy far up the slope of ultimate southern mountains, fatigue came down upon his toiling mind like snow on the winding ways of a city noisy by night, stilling all. He stood, and the warriors closed up to him. For long they had passed by great oaks standing solitary here and there, like giants taking huge breaths of the night air before doing some furious deed. Now they had come to the verge of a black forest. The tree trunks stood like those great columns in an Egyptian hall, whence God in an older mood received the praise of men. The top of it sloped the way of an ancient wind. Here they all halted, and lighted a fire of branches, striking sparks from flint into a heap of bracken. They eased them of their armor, and sat round the fire, and Camarac stood up there and addressed them, and Camarac said, "We go to war with fate, who has doomed that I shall not come to Carcassone. And if we turn aside but one of the dooms of fate, then the whole future of the world is ours, and the future that fate has ordered is like the dry course of an averted river. But if such men as we, such resolute conquerors, cannot prevent one doom that fate has planned, then is the race of man enslaved forever to do its petty and allotted task. Then they all drew their swords and waved them high in the firelight and declared war on fate. Nothing in the somber forest stirred or made any sound. Tired men do not dream of war. When morning came over the gleaming fields, a company that had set out from Arn discovered the camping place of the warriors and brought pavilions and provender. And the warriors feasted, and the birds in the forest sang, and the inspiration of Arleon awoke. Then they rose, and following Arleon, entered the forest, and marched away to the south. And many a woman of Arn sent her thoughts with them as they played alone some old monotonous tune. But their own thoughts were far before them, skimming over the bath through whose deeps the river tumbles in marble Carcassone. When butterflies were dancing on the air and the sun neared the zenith, pavilions were pitched, and all the warriors rested. And then they feasted again, and then played nightly games, and late in the afternoon marched on once more, singing of Carcassone. And night came down with its mystery on the forest, and gave their demonic look again to the trees, and rolled up out of misty hollows a huge and yellow moon. And the men of Arn lit fires, and sudden shadows arose and leaped fantastically away. And the night wind blew, arising like a ghost, and passed between the tree trunks, and slipped down some shimmering glades, and waked the prowling beasts still dreaming of day, and drifted nocturnal birds afield to menace timorous things, and beat the roses of the befriending night, and wafted to the ears of wandering men the sound of a maiden song, and gave a glamour to the lutanist's tune played in his loneliness on distant hills. And the deep eyes of moths glowed like a galleon's lamps, and they spread their wings and sailed their familiar sea. Upon this night wind also the dreams of Camarac's men floated to Carcassone. All the next morning they marched, and all the evening, and knew they were nearing now the deeps of the forest. And the citizens of Arn kept close together, and close behind the warriors, for the deeps of the forest were all unknown to travelers, but not unknown to those tales of fear that men tell at evening to their friends, in the comfort and the safety of their hearths. Then night appeared, and an enormous moon, and the men of Camarac slept. Sometimes they woke, and went to sleep again, and those that stayed awake for long and listened heard heavy two-footed creatures pad through the night on paws. As soon as it was light, the unarmed men of Arn began to slip away, and went back by bands through the forest. When darkness came, they did not stop to sleep, but continued their flight straight on until they came to Arn, and added there by the tales they told to the terror of the forest. But the warriors feasted, and afterwards Arleon rose and played his harp, and led them on again, and a few faithful servants stayed with them still. And they marched all day through a gloom that was old as night, but Arleon's inspiration burned in his mind like a star, and he led them till the birds began to drop into the tree-tops, and it was evening, and they all encamped. They had only one pavilion left to them now, and near it they lit a fire, and Camarac posted a sentry with drawn sword just beyond the glow of the firelight. Some of the warriors slept in the pavilion, and others round about it. When dawn came, something terrible had killed and eaten the sentry, but the splendor of the rumors of Carcassone and fate's decree that they should never come there, and the inspiration of Arleon and his harp, all urged the warriors on, and they marched deeper and deeper all day into the forest. Once they saw a dragon that had caught a bear and was playing with it,
letting it run a little way and overtaking it with a paw. They came at last to a clear space in the forest just before nightfall. An odor of flowers arose from it like a mist, and every drop of dew interpreted heaven unto itself. It was the hour when twilight kisses earth. It was the hour when a meaning comes into senseless things, and trees out majesty the pomp of monarchs, and the timid creatures steal abroad to feed, and as yet the beasts of prey harmlessly dream, and earth utters a sigh, and it is night. In the midst of the wide clearing, Camarac's warriors camped, and rejoiced to see stars again appearing one by one. That night they ate the last of their provisions, and slept unmolested by the prowling things that haunt the gloom of the forest. On the next day some of the warriors hunted stags, and others lay in rushes by a neighboring lake and shot arrows at waterfowl. One stag was killed, and some geese, and several teal. Here the adventurers stayed, breathing the pure wild air that cities know not. By day they hunted and lit fires by night, and sang and feasted, and forgot Carcassone. The terrible denizens of the gloom never molested them. Venison was plentiful, and all manner of waterfowl. They loved the chase by day, and by night their favorite songs. Thus day after day went by, thus week after week. Time flung over this encampment a handful of moons, the gold and silver moons that waste the year away. Autumn and winter passed, and spring appeared, and still the warriors hunted and feasted there. One night of the springtide they were feasting about a fire and telling tales of the chase, and the soft moths came out of the dark and flaunted their colors in the firelight, and went out gray into the dark again. And the night wind was cool upon the warriors' necks, and the campfire was warm in their faces, and a silence had settled among them after some song. And Arleon all at once rose suddenly up, remembering Carcassone, and his hand swept over the strings of his harp, awaking the deeper chords, like the sound of a nimble people dancing their steps on bronze. And the music rolled away into the night's own silence, and the voice of Arleon rose. When there is blood in the bath, she knows there is war in the mountains, and longs for the battle shout of kingly men. And suddenly all shouted, Carcassone, and at that word their idleness was gone as a dream is gone from a dreamer waked with a shout. And soon the great march began that faltered no more nor wavered, unchecked by battles, undaunted in lonesome spaces, ever unwearied by the vulturous years. The warriors of Camarac held on, and Arleon's inspiration led them still. They cleft with the music of Arleon's harp the gloom of ancient silences. They went singing into battles with terrible wild men, and came out singing, but with fewer voices. They came to villages and valleys full of the music of bells, or saw the lights at dusk of cottages sheltering others. They became a proverb for wandering, and a legend arose of strange, disconsolate men. Folks spoke of them at nightfall, when the fire was warm and rain slipped down the eaves. And when the wind was high, small children feared the men who would not rest were going clattering past. Strange tales were told of men in old gray armor, moving at twilight along the tops of the hills, and never asking shelter. And mothers told their boys who grew impatient of home that the gray wanderers were once so impatient, and were now hopeless of rest, and were driven along with the rain whenever the wind was angry. But the wanderers were cheered in their wandering by the hope of coming to Carcassone, and later on by anger against fate, and at last they marched on still because it seemed better to march on than to think. For many years they had wandered and had fought with many tribes. Often they gathered legends in villages and listened to idle singers singing songs, and all the rumors of Carcassone still came from the south. And then one day they came to a hilly land with a legend in it that only 3 valleys away a man might see, on clear days, Carcassone. Tired though they were, and few, and worn with the years which had all brought them wars, they pushed on instantly, led still by Arleon's inspiration, which dwindled in his age, though he made music with his old harp still. All day they climbed down into the first valley, and for 2 days ascended, and came to the town that may not be taken in war, below the top of the mountain, and its gates were shut against them, and there was no way round. To left and right steep precipices stood for as far as eye could see or legend tell of, and the pass lay through the city. Therefore Camarac drew up his remaining warriors in line of battle to wage their last war, and they stepped forward over the crisp bones of old unburied armies. No sentinel defied them in the gate, no arrow flew from any tower of war. One citizen climbed alone to the mountain's top, and the rest hid themselves in sheltered places. Now in the top of the mountain was a deep bowl-like cavern in the rock, in which fires bubbled softly. And if any cast a boulder into the fires, as it was the custom for one of those citizens to do when enemies approached them, the mountain hurled up intermittent rocks for 3 days, and the rocks fell flaming all over the town and all round about it. And just as Camarac's men began to batter the gate, they heard a crash on the mountain, and a great rock fell beyond them and rolled into the valley. The next 2 fell in front of them on the iron roofs of the town. Just as they entered the town, a rock found them crowded in a narrow street, and shattered 2 of them. The mountain smoked and panted. With every pant a rock plunged into the streets or bounced along the heavy iron roof, and the smoke went slowly up and up and up. When they had come through the long town's empty streets to the locked gate at the end, only 15 were left. When they had broken down the gate, there were only 10 alive. 3 more were killed as they went up the slope, and 2 as they passed near the terrible cavern. Fate let the rest go some way down the mountain upon the other side, and then took 3 of them. Camarac and Arleon alone were left alive, and night came down on the valley to which they had come, and was lit by flashes from the fatal mountain, and the 2 mourned for their comrades all night long. But when the morning came, they remembered their war with fate, and their old resolve to come to Carcassone, and the voice of Arleon rose in a quavering song, and snatches of music from his old harp, and he stood up and marched with his face southwards, as he had done for years, and behind him Camarac went. And when at last they climbed from the 3rd valley, and stood on the hill's summit in the golden sunlight of evening, their aged eyes saw only miles of forest, and the birds going to roost. Their beards were white, and they had traveled very far and hard. It was the time with them when a man rests from labors and dreams in light sleep of the years that were, and not of the years to come. Long they looked southwards, and the sun set over remoter forests, and glowworms lit their lamps, and the inspiration of Arleon rose and flew away forever, to gladden perhaps the dreams of younger men. And Arleon said, "My king, I know no longer the way to Carcassone." And Camarac smiled, as the aged smile, with little cause for mirth, and said, "The years are going by us like huge birds, whom doom and destiny and the schemes of God have frightened up out of some old gray marsh, and it may well be that against these no warrior may avail, and that fate has conquered us, and that our quest has failed." And after this they were silent. Then they drew their swords, and side by side went down into the forest, still seeking Carcassone. I think they got not far, for there were deadly marshes in that forest, and gloom that outlasted the nights, and fearful beasts accustomed to its ways. Neither is there any legend, either in verse or among the songs of the people of the fields, of any having come to Carcassone. End of Carcassone.
In Zaccarath. Come, said the king in sacred Zaccarath, and let our prophets prophesy before us. A far-seen jewel of light was the holy palace, a wonder to the nomads on the plains. There was the king with all his underlords, and the lesser kings that did him vassalage, and there were all his queens with all their jewels upon them. Who shall tell of the splendor in which they sat, of the thousand lights and the answering emeralds, of the dangerous beauty of that horde of queens, or the flash of their laden necks? There was a necklace there of rose-pink pearls, beyond the art of the dreamer to imagine. Who shall tell of the amethyst chandeliers, where torches, soaked in rare Byrrhenian oils, burned and gave off a scent of blethany? This herb marvelous, which, growing near the summit of Mount Zomnos, scents all the Zomnian range, and is smelt far out on the Capuscran plains, and even, when the wind is from the mountains, in the streets of the city of Ognoth. At night it closes its petals and is heard to breathe, and its breath is a swift poison. This it does even by day if the snows are disturbed about it. No plant of this has ever been captured alive by a hunter. Enough to say that when the dawn came up, it appeared by contrast pallid and unlovely, and stripped bare of all its glory, so that it hid itself with rolling clouds. Come, said the king, let our prophets prophesy. Then the herald stepped through the ranks of the king's silk-clad warriors, who lay oiled and scented upon velvet cloaks, with a pleasant breeze among them caused by the fans of slaves. Even their casting spears were set with jewels. Through their ranks the heralds went with mincing steps, and came to the prophets, clad in brown and black, and one of them they brought and set him before the king. And the king looked at him and said, Prophesy unto us. And the prophet lifted his head, so that his beard came clear from his brown cloak. And the fans of the slaves that fanned the warriors wafted the tip of it a little awry. And he spake to the king, and spake thus. Woe unto thee, king, and woe unto Zaccarath! Woe unto thee, and woe unto thy women, for your fall shall be sore and soon. Already in heaven the gods shun thy God. They know his doom and what is written of him. He sees oblivion before him like a mist. Thou hast aroused the hate of the mountaineers. They hate thee all along the crags of Droom. The evilness of thy days shall bring down the Zedians on thee, as the sons of springtide bring the avalanche down. They shall do unto Zaccarath as the avalanche doth unto the hamlets of the valley. When the queens chattered or tittered among themselves, he merely raised his voice and still spake on. Woe to these walls and the carven things upon them! The hunters shall know the camping places of the nomads by the marks of the campfires on the plain, but he shall not know the place of Zaccarath. A few of the recumbent warriors turned their heads to glance at the prophet when he ceased. Far overhead the echoes of his voice hummed on a while among the cedarn rafters. Is he not splendid? Said the king. And many of that assembly beat with their palms upon the polished floor in token of applause. Then the prophet was conducted back to his place at the far end of that mighty hall, and for a while musicians played on marvelous curved horns, while drums throbbed behind them, hidden in a recess. The musicians were sitting cross-legged on the floor, all blowing their huge horns in the brilliant torchlight. But as the drums throbbed louder in the dark, they arose and moved slowly nearer to the king. Louder and louder drummed the drums in the dark, and nearer moved the men with the horns, so that their music should not be drowned by the drums before it reached the king. A marvelous scene it was when the tempestuous horns were halted before the king, and the drums in the dark were like the thunder of God, and the queens were nodding their heads in time to the music, with their diadems flashing like heavens of falling stars. And the warriors lifted their heads and shook, as they lifted them, the plumes of those golden birds which hunters wait for by the Lydian lakes, in a whole lifetime killing scarcely 6, to make the crests that the warriors wore when they feasted in Zaccarath. Then the king shouted, and the warriors sang. Almost they remembered then old battle chants, and as they sang the sound of the drums dwindled, and the musicians walked away backwards, and the drumming became fainter and fainter as they walked, and altogether ceased, and they blew no more on their fantastic horns. Then the assemblage beat on the floor with their palms, and afterwards the queens besought the king to send for another prophet, and the heralds brought a singer and placed him before the king, and the singer was a young man with a harp, and he swept the strings of it, and when there was silence, he sang of the iniquity of the king. And he foretold the onrush of the Zedians, and the fall and the forgetting of Zaccarath, and the coming again of the desert to its own, and the playing about of little lion cubs where the courts of the palace had stood. "Of what is he singing?" said a queen to a queen. "He is singing of everlasting Zaccarath." As the singer ceased, the assemblage beat listlessly on the floor, and the king nodded to him, and he departed. When all the prophets had prophesied to them, and all the singers sung, that royal company arose and went to other chambers, leaving the hall of festival to the pale and lonely dawn. And alone were left the lion-headed gods that were carven out of the walls. Silent they stood, and their rocky arms were folded, and shadows over their faces moved like curious thoughts as the torches flickered and the dull dawn crossed the fields, and the colors began to change in the chandeliers. When the last lutanist fell asleep, the birds began to sing. Never was greater splendor or a more famous hall. When the queens went away through the curtained door with all their diadems, it was as though the stars should arise in their stations and troop together to the west at sunrise. And only the other day I found a stone that had undoubtedly been a part of Zaccarath. It was 3 inches long and 1 inch broad. I saw the edge of it uncovered by the sand. I believe that only 3 other pieces have been found like it. End of In Zaccarath. The Field. When one has seen spring's blossom fall in London, and summer appear and ripen and decay as it does early in cities, and one is in London still, then, at some moment or another, the country places lift their flowery heads and call to one with an urgent, masterful clearness, upland behind upland in the twilight, like to some heavenly choir arising rank on rank to call a drunkard from his gambling hell. No volume of traffic can drown the sound of it. No lure of London can weaken its appeal. Having heard it, one's fancy is gone and evermore departed to some colored pebble, a gleam in a rural brook, and all that London can offer is swept from one's mind like some suddenly smitten metropolitan Goliath. The call is from afar both in leagues and years, for the hills that call one are the hills that were, and their voices are the voices of long ago, when the elf kings still had horns. I see them now, those hills of my infancy, for it is they that call, with their faces upturned to the purple twilight, and the faint diaphanous figures of the fairies peering out from under the bracken to see if evening is come. I do not see upon their regal summits those desirable mansions and highly desirable residences which have lately been built for gentlemen who would exchange customers for tenants. When the hills called, I used to go to them by road, riding a bicycle. If you go by train, you miss the gradual approach. You do not cast off London like an old forgiven sin, nor pass by little villages on the way that must have some rumor of the hills, nor, wondering if they are still the same, come at last upon the edge of their far-spread robes, and so on to their feet, and see far off their holy, welcoming faces. In the train you see them suddenly round a curve, and there they all are, sitting in the sun. I imagine that as one penetrated out from some enormous forest of the tropics, the wild beasts would become fewer, the gloom would lighten, and the horror of the place would slowly lift. Yet, as one emerges nearer to the edge of London, and nearer to the beautiful influence of the hills, the houses become uglier, the streets viler, the gloom deepens. The errors of civilization stand bare to the scorn of the fields. Where ugliness reaches the height of its luxuriance in the dense misery of the place, where one imagines the builder saying, "Here I culminate, let us give thanks to Satan," there is a bridge of yellow brick, and through it, as through some gate of filigree silver opening on fairyland, one passes into the country. To left and right, as far as one can see, stretches that monstrous city. Before one are the fields, like an old, old song. There is a field there that is full of kingcups. A stream runs through it, and along the stream is a little wood of osiers. There I used often to rest at the stream's edge before my long journey to the hills. There I used to forget London, street by street. Sometimes I picked a bunch of kingcups to show them to the hills. I often came there. At first I noticed nothing about the field except its beauty and its peacefulness. But the second time that I came, I thought that there was something ominous about the field. Down there among the kingcups by the little shallow stream, I felt that something terrible might happen in just such a place. I did not stay long there, because I thought that too much time spent in London had brought on these morbid fancies, and I went on to the hills as fast as I could. I stayed for some days in the country air, and when I came back, I went to the field again to enjoy that peaceful spot before entering London. But there was still something ominous among the osiers. A year elapsed before I went there again. I emerged from the shadow of London into the gleaming sun. The bright green grass and the kingcups were flaming in the light, and the little stream was singing a happy song. But the moment I stepped into the field, my old uneasiness returned, and worse than before. It was as though the shadow was brooding there of some dreadful future thing, and a year had brought it nearer. I reasoned that the exertion of bicycling might be bad for one, and that the moment one rested, this uneasiness might result. A little later I came back past the field by night, and the song of the stream and the hush attracted me down to it. And there the fancy came to me that it would be a terribly cold place to be in the starlight, if for some reason one was hurt and could not get away. I knew a man who was minutely acquainted with the past history of that locality, and him I asked if anything historical had ever happened in that field. When he pressed me for my reason in asking him this, I said that the field had seemed to me such a good place to hold a pageant in. But he said that nothing of any interest had ever occurred there, nothing at all. So it was from the future that the field's terrible trouble came. For 3 years off and on I made visits to the field, and every time more clearly it boded evil things, and my uneasiness grew more acute every time that I was lured to go and rest among the cool green grass under the beautiful osiers. Once, to distract my thoughts, I tried to gauge how fast the stream was trickling, but I found myself wondering if it flowed faster than blood. I felt that it would be a terrible place to go mad in. One would hear voices. At last I went to a poet whom I knew, and woke him from huge dreams, and put before him the whole case of the Field. He had not been out of London all that year, and he promised to come with me and look at the Field, and tell me what was going to happen there. It was late in July when we went. The pavement, the air, the houses, and the dirt had all been baked dry by the summer. The weary traffic dragged on and on and on, and sleep, spreading her wings, soared up and floated from London and went to walk beautifully in rural places. When the poet saw the Field, he was delighted. The flowers were out in masses all along the stream. He went down to the little wood rejoicing. By the side of the stream he stood and seemed very sad. Once or twice he looked up and down it mournfully. Then he bent and looked at the kingcups, first one and then another, very closely, and shaking his head. For a long while he stood in silence, and all my old uneasiness returned, and my bodings for the future. And then I said, "What manner of field is it?" And he shook his head sorrowfully. "It is a battlefield," he said. End of the Field. The Day of the Poll. In the town by the sea it was the day of the poll, and the poet regarded it sadly when he woke and saw the light of it coming in at his window between two small curtains of gauze. And the day of the poll was beautifully bright. Stray bird songs came to the poet at the window. The air was crisp and wintry, but it was the blaze of sunlight that had deceived the birds. He heard the sound of the sea that the moon led up the shore, dragging the months away over the pebbles and shingles, and piling them up with the years where the worn-out centuries lay. He saw the majestic downs stand facing mightily southwards, saw the smoke of the town float up to their heavenly faces. Column after column rose calmly into the morning as house by house was waked by peering shafts of the sunlight and lit its fires for the day. Column by column went up toward the serene downs faces, and failed before they came there and hung all white over houses. And everyone in the town was raving mad. It was a strange thing that the poet did, for he hired the largest motor in the town and covered it with all the flags he could find, and set out to save an intelligence. And he presently found a man whose face was hot, who shouted that the time was not far distant when a candidate, whom he named, would be returned at the head of the poll by a thumping majority. And by him the poet stopped and offered him a seat in the motor that was covered with flags. When the man saw the flags that were on the motor, and that it was the largest in the town, he got in. He said that his vote should be given for that fiscal system that had made us what we are, in order that the poor man's food should not be taxed to make the rich man richer. Or else it was that he would give his vote for that system of tariff reform which should unite us closer to our colonies with ties that should long endure, and give employment to all. But it was not to the polling booth that the motor went. It passed it, and left the town, and came by a small white winding road to the very top of the downs. There the poet dismissed the car, and led that wondering voter on to the grass, and seated himself on a rug. And for long the voter talked of those imperial traditions that our forefathers had made for us, and which he should uphold with his vote. Or else it was of a people oppressed by a feudal system that was out of date and effete, and that should be ended or mended. But the poet pointed out to him small, distant, wandering ships on the sunlit strip of the sea, and the birds far down below them, and the houses below the birds, with the little columns of smoke that could not find the downs. And at first the voter cried for his polling booth like a child.
But after a while he grew calmer, save when faint bursts of cheering came twittering up to the downs, when the voter would cry out bitterly against the misgovernment of the Radical party. Or else it was, I forget what the poet told me, he extolled its splendid record. "See," said the poet, "these ancient, beautiful things, the downs and the old-time houses in the morning, and the gray sea in the sunlight going mumbling round the world. And this is the place they have chosen to go mad in." And standing there with all broad England behind him, rolling northward, down after down, and before him the glittering sea too far for the sound of the roar of it, there seemed to the voter to grow less important the questions that troubled the town. Yet he was still angry. "Why did you bring me here?" he said again. "Because I grew lonely," said the poet, "when all the town went mad." Then he pointed out to the voter some old bent thorns, and showed him the way that a wind had blown for 1,000,000 years, coming up at dawn from the sea. And he told him of the storms that visit the ships, and their names and whence they come, and the currents they drive afield, and the way that the swallows go. And he spoke of the down where they sat, when the summer came, and the flowers that were not yet, and the different butterflies, and about the bats and the swifts, and the thoughts in the heart of man. He spoke of the aged windmill that stood on the down, and of how to children it seemed a strange old man who was only dead by day. And as he spoke, and as the sea wind blew on that high and lonely place, there began to slip away from the voter's mind meaningless phrases that had crowded it long: thumping majority, victory in the fight, terminological inexactitudes, and the smell of paraffin lamps dangling in heated schoolrooms, and quotations taken from ancient speeches because the words were long. They fell away, though slowly, and slowly the voter saw a wider world and the wonder of the sea. And the afternoon wore on, and the winter evening came, and the night fell, and all black grew the sea. And about the time that the stars come blinking out to look upon our littleness, the polling booth closed in the town. When they got back, the turmoil was on the wane in the streets. Night hid the glare of the posters, and the tide, finding the noise abated and being at the flow, told an old tale that he had learned in his youth about the deeps of the sea, the same which he had told to coastwise ships that brought it to Babylon by the way of Euphrates before the doom of Troy. I blame my friend the poet, however lonely he was, for preventing this man from registering his vote, the duty of every citizen. But perhaps it matters less, as it was a foregone conclusion, because the losing candidate, either through poverty or sheer madness, had neglected to subscribe to a single football club. End of the day of the poll. The Unhappy Body. "Why do you not dance with us and rejoice with us?" they said to a certain body. And then that body made the confession of its trouble. It said, "I am united with a fierce and violent soul that is altogether tyrannous and will not let me rest, and he drags me away from the dances of my kin to make me toil at his detestable work. And he will not let me do the little things that would give pleasure to the folk I love, but only cares to please posterity when he has done with me and left me to the worms. And all the while he makes absurd demands of affection from those that are near to me, and is too proud even to notice any less than he demands, so that those that should be kind to me all hate me." And the unhappy body burst into tears. And they said, "No sensible body cares for its soul. A soul is a little thing, and should not rule a body. You should drink and smoke more till he ceases to trouble you." But the body only wept, and said, "Mine is a fearful soul. I have driven him away for a little while with drink, but he will soon come back. Oh, he will soon come back." And the body went to bed, hoping to rest, for it was drowsy with drink. But just as sleep was near it, it looked up, and there was its soul sitting on the window-sill, a misty blaze of light, and looking into the river. "Come," said the tyrannous soul, "and look into the street." "I have need of sleep," said the body. "But the street is a beautiful thing," the soul said vehemently. "100 of the people are dreaming there." "I am ill through want of rest," the body said. "That does not matter," the soul said to it. "There are millions like you in the earth, and millions more to go there. The people's dreams are wandering afield. They pass the seas and mountains of fairies, threading the intricate passes led by their souls. They come to golden temples a-ring with 1,000 bells. They pass up steep streets lit by paper lanterns where the doors are green and small. They know their way to witches' chambers and castles of enchantment. They know the spell that brings them to the causeway along the ivory mountains. On one side, looking downward, they behold the fields of their youth, and on the other lie the radiant plains of the future. Arise and write down what the people dream." "What reward is there for me," said the body, "if I write down what you bid me?" "There is no reward," said the soul. "Then I shall sleep," said the body. And the soul began to hum an idle song sung by a young man in a fabulous land as he passed a golden city where fiery sentinels stood, and knew that his wife was within it, though as yet but a little child, and knew by prophecy that furious wars, not yet arisen in far and unknown mountains, should roll above him with their dust and thirst before he ever came to that city again. The young man sang it as he passed the gate, and was now dead with his wife 1,000 years. "I cannot sleep for that abominable song," the body cried to the soul. "Then do as you are commanded," the soul replied, and wearily the body took a pen again. Then the soul spoke merrily as he looked through the window. "There is a mountain lifting sheer above London, part crystal and part mist. Thither the dreamers go when the sound of the traffic has fallen. At first they scarcely dream because of the roar of it, but before midnight it stops and turns and ebbs with all its wrecks. Then the dreamers arise and scale the shimmering mountain, and at its summit find the galleons of dream. Thence some sail east, some west, some into the past and some into the future, for the galleons sail over the years as well as over the spaces. But mostly they head for the past and the olden harbors, for thither the sighs of men are mostly turned, and the dream ships go before them as the merchantmen before the continual trade winds go down the African coast. I see the galleons even now raise anchor after anchor. The stars flash by them. They slip out of the night. Their prows go gleaming into the twilight of memory, and night soon lies far off, a black cloud hanging low, and faintly spangled with stars, like the harbor and shore of some low-lying land seen afar with its harbor lights. Dream after dream that soul related as he sat there by the window. He told of tropical forests seen by unhappy men who could not escape from London, and never would. Forests made suddenly wondrous by the song of some passing bird flying to unknown eyries and singing an unknown song. He saw the old men lightly dancing to the tune of elfin pipes, beautiful dances with fantastic maidens, all night on moonlit imaginary mountains. He heard far off the music of glittering springs. He saw the fairness of blossoms of apple and May, 30 years fallen. He heard old voices, old tears came glistening back. Romance sat cloaked and crowned upon southern hills, and the soul knew him. One by one he told the dreams of all that slept in that street. Sometimes he stopped to revile the body because it worked badly and slowly. Its chill fingers wrote as fast as they could, but the soul cared not for that. And so the night wore on till the soul heard tinkling in oriental skies far footfalls of the morning. "See now," said the soul, "the dawn that the dreamers dread. The sails of light are paling on those unwreckable galleons. The mariners that steer them slip back into fable and myth. That other sea, the traffic, is turning now at its ebb, and is about to hide its pallid wrecks, and to come swinging back with its tumult at the flow. Already the sunlight flashes in the gulfs behind the east of the world. The gods have seen it from their palace of twilight that they built above the sunrise. They warm their hands at its glow as it streams through their gleaming arches before it reaches the world. All the gods are there that have ever been, and all the gods that shall be. They sit there in the morning, chanting and praising man. I am numb and very cold for want of sleep," said the body. "You shall have centuries of sleep," said the soul. "But you must not sleep now, for I have seen deep meadows with purple flowers flaming tall and strange above the brilliant grass, and herds of pure white unicorns that gambol there for joy, and a river running by with a glittering galleon on it, all of gold, that goes from an unknown inland to an unknown isle of the sea, to take a song from the king of over the hills to the queen of far away. I will sing that song to you, and you shall write it down." "I have toiled for you for years," the body said. "Give me now but one night's rest, for I am exceeding weary." "Oh, go and rest. I am tired of you. I am off," said the soul, and he arose and went we know not whither, but the body they laid in the earth, and the next night at midnight the wraiths of the dead came drifting from their tombs to felicitate that body. "You are free here, you know," they said to their new companion. "Now I can rest," said the body. End of The Unhappy Body.